welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Turn the Page. Today I am one of your hosts, Jen, and I am joined by an illustrious colleague. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh my goodness, illustrious. I have to fill big shoes. My name is Kay, and I'm one of the Reader Services librarians here at the library. And we are here with another illustrious guest of ours, Matt Baume, who wrote this really fun book, but I'm going to let him introduce that and talk about that. So
yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me. A real pleasure to be here. Very, very happy to talk about books and television and libraries, all of which I could not have written this book without.
Love to hear it. So yeah, would you like to tell us, we can start out just with the book itself. Could you tell us a little bit about Hi Honey, I'm Homo, and maybe how it came out of your work on the YouTube and your previous work?
Yeah, so Hi Honey, I'm Homo is sort of a guided tour through queer episodes of television going back to the 60s and Bewitched, and then up through the 70s with Soap and Alice, and into the 80s with the Golden Girls, then the 90s with Friends and Will and Grace, and of course Ellen, and into the 2000s with Modern Family. And along the way, while we're enjoying all of these sitcom moments with queer characters, there's a lot of actual real life history that is strangely, unexpectedly illustrated by the sitcoms and the fun TV shows and the wacky characters that we love to spend time with. So that's kind of Hi Honey, I'm Homo in a nutshell. And it came out of a YouTube channel that I do that I've been doing for a couple of years, where I look at sitcoms and also movies and dramas and made for TV films and all this kind of stuff, like the screened entertainment that folks love. Where I've been taking a look at those and telling the story of their making and their place in history from a primarily queer perspective. And I got into that work because I was working in the film and television industry for a long time. And then in my free time, my personal time, I was also working a lot of LGBTQ activism and liberation projects and that kind of stuff. And I started to see over time how similar those two worlds were, kind of unexpectedly. Entertainment and politics. That entertainment is very much about reflecting the world we live in and the world that we want to live in. And politics is very much about making that, hopefully, ideally, fingers crossed, making the world that we want to live in an actual thing. And the two things, those two worlds, politics and entertainment, really are in conversation with each other all the time. And one of the things that I really noticed is how much our television over the past few decades tells the story of, among many things, the struggle for queer liberation. So I was really excited to use comedy and sitcoms as a way to tell that story.
it's actually from your YouTube channel that we learned about you. Your channel was the channel that I watched the most videos on, like in a row. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. So, I mean, like, I feel like I've learned a lot about like our history and queer history. And then from there, Jen was on your Twitter, X, whatever. And she was like, he has a book. We have to interview him. And now here we are. So yeah, I mean, I'm spinning off of that, I do have a good question for you. From writing for YouTube versus writing for a book, like what's your process between the two? Are they different? Are they similar? Did you like one over the other?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And they are quite different. When I'm writing for YouTube, I'm obviously writing to speak out loud, which is really different from the kind of, I guess, just down to like little nitty gritty stuff, like sentence structure is very different for delivering a video versus writing for the page. In addition to doing a lot of YouTube work, I got my start writing for blogs and doing journalism. This is back in the ancient days of like 2003, 2004, when blogs were a new thing. Nobody really knew what was going to happen with them. So, I'm really, I had a lot of background writing for the written word, and then also kind of learning, I guess, in doing the YouTube channel, I really had to learn more about writing to speak out loud. Also very fortunately, some of the journalism that I've done has been for NPR and for the radio. And there's, a real lesson that you learn about how I don't want to say simple, but how sentences need to be followable when you're saying them out loud. versus on the page. I really have to discipline myself and be like, okay, one idea per sentence. Come on, keep it simple. Why it can't be these run-ons like I'm, writing. It's like the 1800s and I'm writing it, in Valley Forge or something. But I think zooming out a little bit from a kind of a higher level perspective. Writing the book was a real thrill because I got to tell a much broader, longer story. When I'm writing for YouTube, it's very focused on one particular element of history. And I don't always get to show how one thing leads to the next, if I'm doing a video, for example, about Ellen, it's a video about Ellen. And I might say, and next time I'll have a video about Will and Grace, so stay tuned. And with the book, I could much more directly say, here's the whole story with the Ellen show. And that's going to lead right into Will and Grace, which is our very next chapter. So stay tuned. I guess it's sort of like a marathon. Writing a book is more like a whole programming block, a marathon of shows. And so that was a real delight to get to do that with Hi Honey, I'm Homo.
YouTube is like a sprint.
Yes.
We're gonna do that metaphor.
Yeah. I imagine the deadline structure is really different too, because with YouTube, you are putting out your thoughts at a much more regular clip, but a book is sort of this longer view project. I'm really curious in particular, not to get too meta about it, but about the interview element of your book. Because as interviewers, we are interested in, being good interviewers. I'm also curious about now that you have been on both sides of the table, because you have also been interviewed for other things and have been talking heads in like pop culture critiques and documentaries and stuff like that. What are those experiences like for you, and how do you approach both? That's kind of a big question.
It's a big question.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I love that question. Both being on one side, the side of the conversation is the interviewer, and the side of the conversation is the interviewee. I don't know, like doing both has really given me an appreciation for how difficult they can be. When I'm doing an interview with, when I'm interviewing someone, especially for this book, and a lot of people were really generous with their time. It was a thrill to get to interview, for example, Norman Lear. It was wonderful to get to interview this 100-year-old man who has seen so much incredible change on television throughout the course of his life. This is going to sound a little cliche, but a place that I always find myself going back to is, the basic questions: who, what, when, where, why. Why is really the important one, I think. I find myself asking why, but why'd you do that? Or why was that important? Or why did that happen after that? Why is such an important question in an interview, no matter what you're talking about. So that's really, when I'm at a loss for words, that's often, and I'm not sure what question to pose next. That's often where I find my mind drifting. And I would say, on the other side, when I'm being interviewed, the experience of talking to folks and getting their thoughts, especially when I'm doing it for a video and, I'm putting people's actual experiences. Recently I did a video about the movie Straight Jacket, which came out in the early 2000s, and it's about a film that's set in the 1950s. And so I interviewed a lot of the people who were involved in the making, and they were so generous and so eager to talk about it. And I was really fortunate. And was able to put some of their perspective clips of our conversation into my YouTube video so that they could actually tell their own story in their own words. And I will say that my experience of doing that has really given me an appreciation for interview subjects who can speak in sentences that are easy to edit. I really appreciate when people can start and end a sentence, which is something that's very hard for me. It's all one run-on often when I talk. But people who are able to speak in complete sentences to write is so easy for me. Like, I love writing, but speaking in a complete sentence is a real challenge. It's something that I still struggle with to this day.
We know what that's like.
Yeah, it is hard. Yeah.
I find that sometimes when I ask a question, I'm like, all right, we need to reel it back in. We're going to, yeah. So I totally know what that's like.
And with so yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that video about Straight Jacket, I think was the first video I sent you, Jen. I think because I was like, I want to watch this movie, but I don't know where to find it. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, it's this thing. This guy did this video about this. And and now we're here. So there you go.
Yay. Oh, I love that. I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, so one of the first videos I watched that you made, and I'm not trying to like gush or anything, was about the Golden Girls. And then after that, I just kind of like tumbled down the rabbit hole. But I find it so fascinating that you focus a lot on like old Hollywood, the 50s and 60s and kind of what it was like then too. Not just the sitcom stuff. But I love that you do a lot with sitcoms too. I don't know. I just like all of it. I am gushing. It's too
Yeah,
late.
it's okay. One of the things that I think really comes out of both the YouTube videos as a whole, when you look at them together, and the book, is that you see the wide range of strategies employed to tell these stories, from like the outright use of overtly queer characters who are talked about in explicit open terms, to more allegorical type, right, treatment of subjects about being marginalized, about being different, and about being accepted and assimilation and all these things. So yeah, could you talk about perhaps, when you're watching the properties that are a little bit less forward, like let's talk about like dinosaurs, for instance. I love that video because it's so allegorical, and yet that it was such a mixed, so mixed, So yeah, like when you are watching something with an eye to what might not be overt, but rather is maybe more implicit. Like what is your lens, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sometimes you do have to give yourself permission to read between the lines. I try not to ascribe motivations to people that, it can't possibly know. Very fortunately, in the case with dinosaurs, the writers of the show were pretty forthcoming about what their motivations were, that they wanted to make a show that was political but also entertaining, that they were really inspired by The Simpsons, so they wanted to make a show that depicted a complex family engaging with real issues of the time. So I was very fortunate that they were able to speak so openly about that. But then, there's things like, for example, I'm working on a video right now about the movie Victim from 1961. Is the first movie that I'm aware of, the first movie to use the word homosexual, to actually say it out loud. And it really highlights, just prior to that, how cagey and quiet and coded everything had to be. I'm thinking like movies like The Children's Hour, for example, where everything's sort of unspoken, it's whispered in an ear. And, it's even, movies into the 60s and 70s, do this funny dance where it's the love that dare not speak its name. So yeah, it is very challenging sometimes to, to look at a work and try to interpret what the artists are trying to say and what they're referring to. Even in the case of, a show like Dinosaurs, obviously that's a family sitcom from the 90s. They have an episode where one of the characters, they're all dinosaurs. It's a show with dinosaur puppets set in the, prehistoric times. One of the characters is interested in vegetarianism, doesn't want to be a meat eater, and their dialogue is so clearly meant to be a reference to sexuality. There's lines, have you tried not being a vegetarian? There's sometimes when I look at a vegetable, I have this funny feeling, or, there's a veggie bar, there's like a vegetable bar that you go to that's very secret and forbidden. The episode itself is a little muddled because sometimes it's about sexuality, sometimes it's kind of about communism. There's like this whole green scare thing that's supposed to be like an allegory for the Red Scare. So it's sometimes about drugs, where they find like a baggie of vegetables in the kids' room. So it's a little muddled. It's a little confusing. But it's so obvious. It's so, like sometimes it's so obvious what they're trying to say. And what you have to do, like what my job is as somebody who's sort of excavating this history and guiding the reader or viewer along with me, is just comparing it to the context of the time, to say, okay, they're using these words, they're using this language. Generally at the time, that language was used to mean this particular thing, because of the work that I do usually about homosexuality. And so that's why they're saying that in that very particular way that maybe today we wouldn't even recognize. It's not like the 90s are that long ago, but the way that someone might talk around homosexuality in the 90s, there's a certain way, there was a certain kind of language that people used. And I guess part of my job and part of the fun of what I do is recognizing how that language has shifted over the decades, and the way that people talked around in the 70s, in a Rock Hudson movie, somebody might say something like, oh, he's a man who likes to swap recipes with his mother. And that's supposed to mean, oh, I see. He's one of those. Is he, and how is he, how that has evolved over the decades is part of the fun of what I do.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that context that you connect it to, especially in the book, because you go deeply into the history of the activism that was also going on at the time and how that was shaping cultural norms to a degree that, people working in television felt more comfortable approaching these things. And I like that it's not just a sort of like a top-down history of like beneficent TV producers and actors deciding to be brave, but also all of the groundwork. So what sort of research did you do on the activism, and how is it informed by your own past? Because you mentioned earlier in the episode that you've done your own activism and you have another nonfiction book connected to that, if I believe, right? Or
Yeah. Yeah. So, very fortunately, I have a lot of foundation here because for a long time, I was working very intensely on marriage equality. I was part of the team that brought one of the marriage equality lawsuits to the Supreme Court in the US. So I was there behind the scenes for all of the political wrangling around marriage equality. It started for me. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I remember the rallies, the protests, and the marches, and the community. I mean, that was one of the things that really drew me in, is feeling like I was a part of a large group of people who are all, kind of more or less pointed in the same direction. We're all working in the same way, different tactics often, but, pointed towards the same thing, which was liberation. And then, the more I got involved in that, I was just sort of as an observer, I started to write about it and report on it and do videos about what was happening with marriage equality. It became more and more important to me and more of my focus. And I officially joined the team. I was doing communications alongside the legal team that was bringing the lawsuit to the Supreme Court. And so it was impossible not to learn a lot about queer history through that work because it was very important, to know where we had come from and the work that had been done prior to us and whose shoulders we were standing on. Met a lot of the people who had been working in the trenches for literally decades and, came to really appreciate their stories. So I wrote a book about a lot of that work. It's called Defining Marriage. And that Defining Marriage tells the personal stories of the people who were engaged in that fight from the 70s up until the Supreme Court ruled in 2015. So, and all the families and, what it's like to be sort of, for your family to be at war, essentially, with your own country, to be, for your family not to be recognized. So a lot of that work and understanding the different tactics that were used, I think that was very important. It's like understanding like there are different kinds of activism. There are the people who are working very much within the system, people in the context of Hi Honey, I'm Homo, queer people working within the television industry who, especially in the 1970s, would often leak scripts to the activists to let them know, to say, hey, they're making the show about this thing and it's going to be really good, or it's going to be really bad. You need to get ready to protest. So they're the people on the inside. They're the people who were very scrappy, very independent, confrontational activists who would engage in the 70s, what were called zaps, where they would, organize these guerrilla actions where they would march into the headquarters of a television network, or they would buy tickets to the opera so that they could surround and confront a politician who was going to the opera. People who were really bold and in your face and a little scary. And then there's a group of activists who were sort of in the middle, sort of mediators between those groups, who were, it was sort of in the 2000s, what came to be known as Gay Inc., like Gay Incorporated. The more, respectable is often the word that was used to describe them. The ones who weren't scary, the suit and tie and, the dress up queers, who could get a meeting with the executives without raising their voices. And all three of those groups were very necessary to each other. They're the ones that the scary activists who were really pushing and provided a sense of urgency. There were the people on the inside who were using their positions, often their positions of power, to advocate for change. And they're the activists who could broker compromises. And all of those groups needed each other to be effective, and still, I think, do. Those different levels of activism, I think, are still extremely important.
and very, yeah, very helpful, I think, because we are in a period where I mean, not that activism is ever not important, but it's keenly important once again. And so it's important to be reminded, I think, of yeah, the history of that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think it's so fascinating from like our point of view in the future to look back on the past and see, first of all, how far we've come when it comes to representation. But I also wanted to ask, kind of posit this question. Where do you think we're heading next when it comes to, queer rep in sitcoms and movies and all that jazz? I feel like we're kind of entering into like a renaissance right now where unfortunately some companies use it to just be woke, but to be woke for woke's sake.
It's
Corporate
corporatized.
woke, yes. But like, I mean, when we had the gay kiss from Modern Family, I remember watching that on TV with my supportive, but not sure about it family, and just turning to see their faces like, what's the reaction?
Mhm.
I think we're going in a good direction. What do you think, Matt?
I hope so. And I had a very similar experience with The Simpsons when the John Waters episode of The Simpsons was on. I had a lot of tension, interpersonal, not interpersonal, but like within myself. I felt a lot of tension about what are my parents going to say about this gay episode of The Simpsons, and that's why these shows are often so useful. Is it's an opportunity to gauge the reactions of people around you, and hopefully, ideally, to maybe move the attitudes of people around you if they do indeed need that. Where we're at now, I think we're in a place that's very comfortable. And also, I think there's some red flags. There's some reasons for concern at the moment. In the past, queer stories in movies, and I'm talking about like decades past, were often about how difficult, the hard, challenging, lonely life of the homosexual, or whatever language they happen to use at the time. Because that was the story to tell about, the difficulty, the people will reject you, and you'll face a lot of loneliness, and you won't be able to be a contributing member of society. I found this video recently, this film about teenagers in the 1950s, and it's very much about how it literally says verbatim, it says something like, a person who isn't willing to conform is going to have a very difficult time of it in the life ahead. So a lot of the stories were awfully depressing, especially into the 80s with the epidemic. A lot of stories about queer people were awfully depressing. And that became a little numbing and oppressive. I think it's delightful that we've entered a time when there's a lot of queer joy, and we can tell stories where there are queer characters, and it's not even about their queerness. They're just there, and it doesn't have to be the crisis of the week. What do we do about this queer person? And I think that's wonderful and excellent. I love that we get to experience stories of queer joy at last. However, I do think that there's been sort of a turning away from those very dark, very difficult stories. And, that does kind of concern me, because those stories do serve a purpose. As difficult as it can be to see a story about, someone facing opposition when they come out of the closet, for example, that is a reality of some people's lives. And like I said, those stories often serve a very important purpose. They can help redirect people's bigotry when they see that bigotry reflected in a piece of entertainment. It's an opportunity to show, like, this is the wrong way to respond when someone comes out of the closet, and here's the right way. It's often an opportunity to understand the similarities between people who may not see eye to eye, who may be different, and that bridging that gap is often a way to advance real life social change. So I do get a little concerned at how positive depictions are these days. I do think we need a little bit of the negativity. We need a little bit of the worst case scenario, just to, for one thing, because things aren't 100% great. It's not like we fixed it and life for queer people is always going to be great from now on, and we never have to worry again. The advances that we've made over the last 100 or so years happened because of people working very hard, and happened because of people working to protect those advances. And I think without those people working to protect those advances, there is a real risk of it sliding back. And I do think we are seeing that in, attempts to ban books or to restrict access in schools and libraries. I think it's really worrisome. And I think one of the reasons that those forces of censorship, which really are, it's forces of bigotry. They're using censorship as sort of a cudgel against a group that they don't like. But I think one reason that they're able to find the success that they do is because, after 20 or so years of great victories, marriage equality and military service and, adoption access, so much has gone our way. I do think that there is a risk of some complacency. And so I think media and entertainment is a great way to, I don't know, be maybe a canary in a coal mine, or to provide at least one level of defense against the tug of war pulling us back in the other direction.
Mhm. That's so interesting. And it does make me think about, again, the way that the book does discuss representation and how that's changed over time, but also like the cultural forces behind that and the work it took to get there, because you have, like today, there is, I think like there's so many different kinds of representation, like, because you have things like Our Flag Means Death, where it's about queerness, but like not every story is about people telling each other that they are queer, or like you're progressing the narrative. But then you look at Marvel movies, and where progressivism is like two dads that are featured extras that they can cut out for the foreign market, and so
or the Star Wars where they have the lesbian kiss, but it's in the background and they can cut it out because it's 2 seconds long.
Yeah. And so like I guess that's a long way into this question about like when you are looking at different media, how do you think about like the market forces that are also, I guess, guiding representation in addition to like the on the ground activism and the creative decisions?
Yeah, I think, to answer your question, I think that queer people will always face a challenge in that there are not as many of us that, just because of the nature of how sexual orientation and gender identity just works. Generally speaking, right now, at this point in our culture, queer people of a variety of different flavors and stripes and colors um, are going to be in the minority. And, as much as people are becoming more comfortable with questioning that and saying, hey, maybe, realizing that they might be queer in ways that might not have occurred to them, which I think is wonderful. I think there is always going to be a minority status that makes it difficult for queer people to make the case for their inclusion, especially when you're looking purely at an economic standpoint, a capitalist standpoint. If a company that just wants to make the most money possible, it's always going to be a challenge to be like, yeah, so why should we cater to this very small group? If the goal is purely to make money, I think that is an understandable question. So I guess this is a very long way of saying that it's capitalism's fault, and
Yes.
but
Yes.
we're always going to be, to some extent, swimming upstream against capitalism. And so we have to find reasons to make the case for our inclusion that exists outside of just purely wanting to make as much money as possible. And there can be a lot of reasons for that. Just like simple human decency is one of them. But there's a lot of reasons to be loud and insistent and demanding. I think that is really, at the end of the day, what is required is, because we are a minority, it does require that we make a lot of noise and be awfully annoying sometimes in our demands, our insistence that we be included, and not just in the media itself, but in the production of it. It's just so incredibly vital that queer people be, and people of all different kinds of marginalized groups, people of color and people with disabilities and people with different socioeconomic backgrounds, that everybody be given a seat at the table in the production of media, I think is just so incredibly, incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your earlier point, I think, we are in this sort of moment where there is a lot of that joyful representation. But like the media market is in such flux right now too, and a lot of that was because of like the proliferation of streamers and stuff like that. But now some of that's getting walked back. And so to your earlier point about the importance of ongoing efforts, we want to make sure this continues, like, if Hulu fails and it's not profitable, so
I don't think Disney's gonna let that happen.
no, yeah, no, that's a bad example, but Peacock, let's say.
Peacock,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, I do think there is a real risk there. And I think it's a good thing and a bad thing. It's like it's a mixed bag or a double-edged sword or whatever metaphor you want to use. The proliferation of streaming and the availability of media on the internet. On one hand, I think it's amazing. It's fantastic that stuff is available in ways that it never could be before. Like what a struggle it was when there were, say, 3 networks to get one queer character going. Because there was such a limit on what could be produced and put in front of people. Now there's so much, you're never going to see it all. I mean, I just saw a news report about this beloved show that's getting canceled after 6 or 7 seasons, and it was the first time I'd heard of it. Like, how can it be beloved? I've never heard of it. But that's just the world that we live in now, that you don't find out about things until they're gone sometimes. So on one hand, the world's at our fingertips, and there's so much more available than there ever was before, and that's great. But it also means that it can be hard to find stuff. It also means that there are a lot more bubbles. So if you don't want to encounter a queer character, there's a good chance you won't. If you want to avoid that media, it's very easy to do so. There used to be a time when we would have these sort of, I don't know what to call it exactly, like a Rosetta Stone maybe, or like it's just a common, like a way of understanding or translating experiences. Because our media was so limited, we were all going to see pretty much everybody was going to know about the episode of Seinfeld, for example, where they're mistaken for gay. Everyone was going to know about the lesbian marriage on Friends, because 30 million people are watching something because they don't have that many choices. And I'm not going to say like limiting choices is a good thing, but because we had so few streams where we could experience media, we had a lot more experiences in common. And I think that actually is a good thing. Having, a cultural experience that a lot of people are familiar with and a lot of people can talk about. I think there's a lot of value to that. And I don't see a lot of opportunities to do that today. There's like Game of Thrones, for example, I think might be one of the very few and perhaps last experiences that are like that. And I don't know that there's ever going to be any going back to, a limited stream of media and entertainment. Unless something happens to the internet, which I think is unlikely, I don't think we're ever going to go back to, you can watch ABC, CBS, and NBC, and that's it. Like those days are gone. So I don't know what the solution is. I was talking to somebody a few days ago about how I see an opportunity here, and I don't know if this is going to happen, for small, low budget local media to make some inroads. And I don't know if that's going to happen because there are a lot of economic reasons that is very challenging too. But I can see a rise. I could see a world in which there's more very low budget, local, scrappy, almost zine type publications. I could see a world where live theater becomes more important. And what I love about that, the reason I want that to happen is because so many of those sitcoms that I love would also make great live theater experiences. Oh my God, what I wouldn't give for some theater company that just takes all the scripts from All in the Family and just produces one a week. You could go live and see an episode, a production of All in the Family every single week at, a local theater or bar or something like that. So I think there's an opportunity there. I don't know if that's going to happen because there's a lot of economic reasons why it's very difficult to produce art now in a way that it wasn't 30 or 40, 50 years ago. But what an amazing thing if that actually, if my vision of the future where local media becomes more important, if that actually comes to pass, what a dream that would be.
Oh, I live in hope.
Right?
Yeah.
Imagine the Golden Girls on stage.
Yes. Oh, if I could just see Golden Girls
Yeah.
I need to be
Every week they have a new episode.
Wow.
Imagine that. Imagine you just, like there's some bar with a little stage and, once a week they do one episode of the Golden Girls. I think there are a lot of challenges to that. It's I guess sort of like, Renaissance, a troupe of Renaissance bards traveling from town to town. I
The
don't know.
Renaissance Fair.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Apocalypse plan. Like, if the internet does go away, this will absolutely happen. So
Mhm.
Isn't that the plot of that's a plot of a book?
yeah.
Anyway.
There is, I can't remember the name of it, but there's an amazing stage play it's set after an apocalypse that is not really specified. But it's something like, I'm gonna like misremember about 10% of this, but Act 1 is set immediately after. Act 2 is 100 years later, and Act 3 is like 500 years later. And each act is the survivors telling the story of one episode of The Simpsons. And it's right after the apocalypse, trying to remember this episode of The Simpsons and cheer each other up with this story. Then it's them this story has become sort of canonical, and it's become sort of a religious thing. And then Act 3 is an entire society built around this episode of Simpsons. And so I don't know. It's some vision of the future that I can actually see. Like, that seems plausible to me.
It does. Wow. That's amazing. Well, this conversation has gone so many interesting places. We've talked about the past, the present, the future of all media. So thank you for coming and talking about these really big ideas with us. We've had a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is great.
Oh, wonderful. Love talking about TV and history and queer stuff. So happy to do it anytime.
All right.
It's good to know.
Thank you so much. All right, listeners, please check out Hi, Honey, I'm Homo. It is so much fun as a book. It is so well researched, and it is full of really interesting anecdotes from people who were there on the front lines of the activism and of TV and representation. So it's so much fun. And check out the YouTube videos too.
Oh, they're
my gosh,
amazing.
so great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.